Hello and welcome. My name's Chris Cann with Harbour Insight, and with me I have Andrew Penkethman, who is Chief Executive of Ardea Resources. Ardea is working on its Kalgoorlie Nickel Project in Western Australia with its JV partners Sumitomo and Mitsubishi, and we're having a series of conversations with Andrew to deep dive into how it's all shaping up. And in this conversation, we want to take a look at the growth opportunities at the project, both from a operational perspective and looking at some of the geology. Welcome, Andrew.
Good to be here, Chris.
For people who are interested in the geology, and hopefully that's most people and most investors at the very least, I was hoping you'd give us a bit of a high-level explanation of how laterite ore bodies evolve and what they look like compared to the sulfides, which I think, even though laterites, as we've discussed previously, are the more dominant source of nickel production in Australia, potentially people are more used to the sulfide story.
Thanks, Chris. And we'll start with the geology, and you don't want to get bogged down in technical detail, depending on who you're speaking with and what they're particularly interested in. But first and foremost, the geology of every mineral deposit is the first and most important building block, because it's then from there the detailed engineering studies and ultimately the study outcomes, including financial metrics. But if you come back to the geology and there's flaws or the level of understanding isn't sufficient, there can be negative flow-on effects. So I'm biased, I am a geologist. However, that understanding's really important. And with nickel laterites, it's an oxide as opposed to a sulfide form of nickel and cobalt, and they form through weathering over hundreds and ultimately millions of years, depending on the geological setting. So we've got young nickel laterites in the tropics, jurisdictions like the Philippines, New Caledonia and Indonesia, and then some of the older laterites in jurisdictions like Australia. They all start with ultramafic rocks. So ultramafic rocks naturally elevated in the ore-bearing minerals, nickel and cobalt, for instance. And through weathering, movements in the groundwater, progressively the silicate minerals are leached out, and you're left ultimately with, in the best tropical style deposits, with this iron-rich material, 40 to 50% iron, 1 to 2% cobalt, 1 to 2% nickel, and 0.1 to 0.2% cobalt. And that's very much the case at the Kalgoorlie Nickel Project. But the Goongarrie South deposit at Goongarrie, it is the largest and highest grade deposit, and there we've had more intensive weathering. So we used to have Lake Goongarrie many millions of years ago overlying the Walter Williams Formation, which is our host rock ultramafic that's weathered to form these nickel laterite deposits, not the entire Walter Williams Formation sequence. It's been a large volcanic inflow of iron-rich minerals from deep in the Earth's crust and mantle that's come to surface at a rapid rate. It's cooled down quickly, and then progressively we've had that weathering leaching out the silicates. But as I mentioned, at Lake Goongarrie, where we've had the lake many millions of years ago overlying the Walter Williams Formation, we've had the water table, we've had more intense movements in the water table. So that silicate minerals are largely being leached out, and what that leaves us with is this premium goethite material. And the characteristics of that are low acid consumption, high grade, soft, predominantly free dig, so minimal energy requirement for mining, minimal energy requirement for your comminution circuit where the ore is crushed and ground to sufficient grind size prior to processing. Nickel laterites are incredibly important ore source. They currently comprise approximately 80% of global nickel production. We see the Kalgoorlie Nickel Project as playing an incredibly important role in the energy transition as a long-term secure source of nickel cobalt.
Thanks, Andrew. The idea of a laterite project, as you say, there are a couple of different types. The ones in the tropics, the fresher ones, the newer ones that are almost evolving at the moment, and then the Goongarrie at the Kalgoorlie Nickel Project, as you say, that slightly older style of project, which has some benefits. Are there other analogies that you could draw on from around the world that are more like what you've got at the Kalgoorlie Nickel Project and Goongarrie, and less like those newer ones in the tropics that investors in the market might be familiar with?
If we go back to the 1950s and 1960s, we saw the development of the Moa Bay nickel deposits in Cuba, and those operations are still continuing today. So it shows that the style of mineralisation very much amenable as long-term source of nickel and cobalt. But if we look at the Williams Formation nickel laterite in Eastern Goldfields, Western Australia, it's about 2.6 billion years old. It's incredibly old, and been subject to tectonism and weathering over billions of years. We compare that to some of the younger nickel laterites that are only tens or hundreds of millions of years. But the tropical laterites tend to have the best characteristics in terms of low acid consumption, high grade, and that's very much the case for our Goongarrie South deposit. So it's more amenable to the premium tropical style nickel laterite deposit. But similarly, there are some other advantages within some of our deposits that you don't necessarily see in the tropics. So whilst most of our ore will be direct feed, some of it will be subject to beneficiation. And in that instance, you might have some zones or plates of silica. And, they might be sub-horizontal to, blocks approximately fist size. But you imagine you mine that material, you put it over a conventional screen, the oversized silica-rich material is going to go to one side, to the oversized, and then the fines that contain the nickel and cobalt will go to the fine fraction, and that will be the ore feed, but you end up processing fewer tonnes at higher grade. And again, that's one of the opportunities we have. I'll be very clear, when we did the PFS in 2023, 69% of our ore feed was the premium goethite, but some of the material for beneficiation can increase the grade, and we feel we've got a perfect blend of both direct feed ore and beneficiable ore to maximise the value from our mine plan and operation.
I wanted to ask you some other questions around the growth opportunities with the processing that you're looking at with the definitive feasibility. But before we get to that, Andrew, I wanted to better understand the geology and probably the scale of the opportunity there. So what's happening at Goongarrie, in the Goongarrie Hub, and the immediate joint venture Kalgoorlie Nickel Project, part of the tenement holding? What's the opportunity there? And then looking at the Kalpini tenements that are sitting beyond that Goongarrie holding, and is that just more of the same, or does that look slightly different? And how does that growth upside opportunity look for you?
Look, terrific question. So if we start at Goongarrie, there's a mineral resource of approximately 4 million tonnes that contain nickel, but our ore reserve is currently only 1.3 million tonnes that contain nickel. And I've had people say to me, how come you've got such a differential between your mineral resource to ore reserve conversion? I have to point out we only assessed 6 of 9 deposits within the Goongarrie Hub, and that's already defined a plus 40-year mine life and ore reserve. So we see opportunities to expand nickel production both within the Goongarrie Hub, looking at the other 3 deposits in the fullness of time. So that gives us internal expansion potential. In terms of the process plant design, we are allocating space for brownfields expansion. We are looking at a modular design to help fast-track project development and reduce CapEx. So those factors combined give us the internal pipeline of expansion opportunities just within the Goongarrie Hub. And then more broadly, you mentioned the Kalgoorlie Hub. So the Goongarrie Hub is subject of our incorporated joint venture with Sumitomo Metal Mining and Mitsubishi Corporation progressively earning a 50% interest. Ardea still retains 100% of the Kalgoorlie Hub, where there's another 2 million tonnes of contained nickel hosted, plus additional exploration opportunities for a broad range of base and precious metals, critical minerals as well. So we see huge opportunity to grow organically with the projects already within Ardea's portfolio once we've developed Goongarrie, and we can see that internal pipeline giving us maximum optionality to realise the full value of our Kalgoorlie Nickel Project, which covers approximately 3,500 square kilometres of tenure in one of the mining hotspots of the world.
I can just make sure I understand, Andrew, correctly. So within the project area itself, there is more material that you haven't factored in yet that will be incorporated at some point. Obviously, we're talking about an initial 40-year mine life. So when that happens is probably not that crucial, but it's there. And you've got the processing capacity to do that efficiently as and when it happens. And then separately outside that, you've got almost a separate project area, which could be more feed for the joint venture. It could potentially be incorporated into a joint venture, I would imagine, for a conversation down the road. And also there is potential for other base metals, critical minerals. So it's not a tenement area that is exclusively a nickel cobalt opportunity.
It's spot on, Chris. And we look at the Eastern Goldfields. It started off mining and processing gold ore, and then as time's gone on, nickel, more recently lithium. The geological prospectivity of the Eastern Goldfields, Western Australia, is globally second to none. It's hot property. We use the real estate analogy: location, location, location. Well, this is the premier resources operating jurisdiction in the world, in my opinion. And I spent 30 years operating as a geologist and resources sector employee and assessing projects right around the globe. And I've chosen to come back to Western Australia because I think that's where we get maximum reward for effort, and because of the natural geological prospectivity.
And when you're talking about that natural prospectivity and the options for a number of different commodities, are you including the sulfides? The nickel sulfides are obviously underpinning the laterites there in the Goongarrie Hub and Kalgoorlie as well. Is that part of the mix for you, or do you consider that separately as a natural part of the joint venture upside opportunity?
Look, currently we've got nickel sulfides identified at Emu Lake, which is within our Kalgoorlie Hub project, approximately 70 kilometres northeast of Kalgoorlie. We haven't defined a resource there yet, but we've done sufficient drilling to demonstrate prospectivity, and those zones will be subject to additional work in the future. So that's upside currently for Ardea, but within the ultramafics, within the Goongarrie Hub, work we've done with groups like CSIRO has also demonstrated their prospectivity for hosting nickel sulfides in addition to the known nickel laterite resources. So, we're incredibly sport for choice. Our primary focus was the strategic partner process so that we could progress Goongarrie toward development and ultimate production and cash flow for the company. But we're not losing sight of the upside of all of our other projects, which, as you rightly highlighted, allows optionality for brownfields expansion at lower capital intensity, potentially another standalone operation, and potential for new mineral discoveries, whether they be nickel sulfide, gold, lithium, rare earths. We really are sport for choice with our ground holding.
As a geologist, it must be a little bit frustrating for you to be rightly dedicating your focus to the feasibility study, the definitive feasibility study at Goonyella in the Kalgoorlie Nickel Project, while you've got such a great opportunity sitting on the adjacent ground. Is there any possibility of diverting a little bit of resource, a little bit of time, a little bit of money to having a look at a greater look at some of those options, or is it really very much 100% on the definitive feasibility study and the Kalgoorlie Nickel Project until such a point where that's just an investment decision and kind of moves in its own right?
Look, first and foremost, the focus on delivering Goonyella, successfully completing the definitive feasibility study, and then progressing towards final investment decision with our partners. But we'll never lose sight of the upside on other projects, and that'll come down to dedicated funding and personnel. But we're always doing work on all of our projects, to make sure we keep our tenements in good standing and we meet our minimum expenditure and work commitments. That's always a priority for us, but we will look at further expanding that reach in the years ahead, 100%.
Andrew, that's all we've got time for. Thanks very much for joining us.
Terrific. Thanks, Chris.